I'm Liz Chu. I'm the executive director of the Center for Public Research and Leadership, CPEARL, at Columbia University. We're housed at Columbia Law School. We're a research policy and leadership center that draws on the disciplines of law, business, policy, education, and data sciences. Evolutionary learning is a governance model that drives systems activity through ongoing coordinated experimentation and improvement. And when we say governance, I think it's really important to be clear that we're not talking about sort of what does your org chart look like on paper, but what we're talking about is how your organization or your team or your initiative goes about deciding what policies to implement in what contexts, how to motivate the uptake and implementation of those policies, and how to adapt and improve upon them over time. So evolutionary learning work takes place at all levels and spaces within a given system. And so what it means that at the highest level, whatever sort of the overarching level is of a system, you are organizing that entire set of systems activity around three questions. What are we trying to do and what does success look like? Is what we're doing working as expected? And how might we improve what we're doing? And so there's an overarching hypotheses about the work of the system. There's an overarching set of goals. There are overarching set of measures and activities that are embedded in those, and an overarching set of processes to flag if things are on or off track and to initiate the problem solving cycle at the highest level. But what's really exciting about evolutionary learning is that basically, if you construct your system in an EL design or an learning design, it's not just to have that work happen at the overarching level. It means that in every nested level within that entire system, you have folks working individually and in teams, sometimes in cross functional teams, sometimes in stable teams within one particular work stream, who are asking themselves those same three sets of questions, those same three questions all the time, and organizing their work around those questions too. And so the work at these nested levels roll up into the overarching improvement oriented activity that's driving the work of an entire system. Evolutionary learning is a governance model that we think is for all actors who are working in complex systems. And when we think about complex systems, we're thinking about systems that are nonlinear, highly relational, uncertain as to their future, sort of changing all of the time, with multi-directional, multifaceted causality that's coming at you at any given moment. And so we see education to be one of those complex systems. And as someone who has sort of devoted their career to educational equity, obviously, those actors who are working to benefit the life chances of children is sort of who comes to mind first. But the idea really is that if you're going to achieve the educational outcomes or any outcomes that you want to achieve in complex settings, what you need is you need to organize activity in a way that doesn't shy away from the sort of complexity and uncertainty, but instead is well matched to that complexity and uncertainty. And so often what we see in our education systems is, you have bureaucracy as a predominant approach, other popular approaches, craft, professionalism, managerialism, those two are sort of ill matched to the complexity and scale of the education system. And so we have this governance approach that we see working really well. Some of the highest functioning educational systems, whether they're local education organizations, whether they're state agencies, whether they're nonprofits working in this space, they are using these improvement oriented governance models in opposition to those other models to drive high quality, context specific service provision to whoever they're serving at that particular moment. And so that's who evolutionary learning is for. And that means it's for every single person working in those systems. It's for the folks who are sort of the positional leaders of those systems. It's for the folks who are on the front line of those systems, so that everyone in these systems are both directors and doers. That's one of the sort of tenets of evolutionary learning. I both am deciding what to do and I'm doing it myself. They're both implementers and problem solvers. So you have two jobs at once when you're in an EL system. You're both delivering a service and figuring out how can I do better at delivering that service. and they're facilitators and participants. So you're trying to facilitate whatever the activity is, and you're part of participating in that activity because you're very sort of cognizant of your relationship as a part to the broader whole. Evolutionary learning is very different than typical bureaucracy. It takes some features of typical bureaucracy, but in many ways, it flips bureaucracy on its head. So, when we think about the operating logic of bureaucracy, we often picture the top down triangle that I'm sure so many of you are familiar with. And basically, in a bureaucracy, the way an organization's activity operates and is run is that there are folks at the top of that triangle who are making all of the decisions essentially. They're designing a top down, one size fits all strategy. And then that strategy flows down to folks who are on the front line and passes through all the levels in between, where they translate that top down strategy into activities that happen at every single level below, often through very prescriptive and highly elaborated sets of rules about what folks should or should not be doing at any given moment. And then the way bureaucracy sort of motivates activity in service of this strategy is folks are held accountable for following the rules. So we've defined the strategy from the top. We've outlined in very prescriptive ways what it means to carry out that strategy at all levels of the system. We have rules for what you should be doing to make sure that you're carrying out those activities, and we hold you accountable by saying, you followed that rule or you didn't, which is where the compliance culture comes in with bureaucracy. It's a lot of management through rules and compliance with those rules. That's very different than the logic of an evolutionary learning system. In an evolutionary learning system, the strategy itself is created in a very participatory way. Instead of a top down triangle, we imagine coordinated hives of that activity. So you can imagine sort of overlapping circles of teams with permeable boundaries where folks can come in and outside of teams. But at the center, there's a hub that works with folks at teams throughout the organization to come up with an overarching strategy for that work. But that strategy is viewed as a hypothesis from the get go. So it may be that your strategy is right, but it may be that your strategy is imperfect or flawed in some ways. And so from the beginning, with that overarching strategy as a hypothesis, like I said, the rest of the work is organized to answer three questions. What are we trying to do and what success will look like? So your strategy, named as a hypothesis, answers that. Is what we're doing working as expected? So, what you need to do there is you need to set up a set of measures attached to that strategy, and then a set of systems that allows you to collect information on those measures and flag when something is on or off track, and ongoing review cycles of that, of those data that are collected all along the way, so that the third question can be answered, which is how might we improve? So you can have organizational level problem solving all the way down to individual team or individual person problem solving at any given moment. And so the logic of the system is not sort of compliance with rules, but the logic of the system is driven by an ongoing set of coordinated activities to discover the best strategy to accomplish the goals that you have set out as an organization or as an institution or as a ecosystem of organizations. And so you become there's this blending of doing and deciding because you decide what to do based on the results of what you do. There's a movement from directing or telling, dictating what folks should be doing to participating in facilitated processes together to discover if what you're doing is the right thing to do. And there's an ongoing sense that at any given time, you're trying to implement well so that you can actually learn how to implement better. So there's just a very different logic in terms of how you get folks engaged. So what becomes sort of a sign of merit or success is how well you participate in this ongoing improvement process, as opposed to how well you comply with a fixed set of rules. It means that it becomes much more standard based because you recognize weedy things that are often captured in rules are up for ongoing evolution. And so you work sort of at a level of quality standards as opposed to highly prescriptive rules. and you work with a goal orientation where the outcomes really, really matter, but there's strong attention to implementation measures because how you implement is subject to change based on how well you're moving toward your outcome. So it's an extremely different operating logic of a team, of an organization, of a set of organizations than what we're very, very used to in education, which is sort of predominantly bureaucratic in nature. So, evolutionary learning is highly complementary, and in some case synonymous with other improvement approaches. I think the real question becomes, to what extent are you using improvement as your governance mechanism? Again, sort of the way in which you're organizing activity overall, as opposed to the way that you're solving sort of a identified problem of practice that might have come up in your work, whether you're doing it in a reactive or in a more sort of fundamental change way. What we see a lot, where I would say this is where evolutionary learning could be helpful, is that there are many cases in which folks are using on an individual or a team level evolutionary improvement science or some other improvement discipline to solve a problem that has been flagged, but they're doing that, if you were going to look at it from a governance view, they're doing that actually to fuel the bureaucracy, because what they're doing is they're going to discover a solution that essentially will roll up into an activity mandate that other folks will have to comply with. So I've discovered a new way of um, teaching this lesson in procedural math. I've discovered a new way of introducing this concept in phonics. I've discovered a new way of bringing in immigrant families into our community. There, it could be any range of things, and so they're real problems that folks are trying to discover. But what happens is they turn into what is discovered in these improvement projects are change packages or solution sets that then essentially, like I said, they feed the bureaucracy. Someone at the top gets a hold of them and they say, okay, now everyone is going to do that change package or that solution set. We are going to mandate it. And then we're going to see the extent to which folks apply. So while you have discovered really, really important knowledge using an improvement discipline, the way that that knowledge changes the system is that it changes the system by just trying to scale it through the pre-existing governance model, as opposed to a system using improvement as its governance model. So these are two different lenses, and we think a lot about the opportunity afforded, sort of the limitations of when folks who are doing improvement butt up against the governance model that is constraining them and perhaps limiting the scale or the reach or the depth or the richness of their improvement discovery. We get really excited about working with systems to use improvement as the engine as the coordinating logic for their whole system. And I will say, I think this is incredibly important right now, moving improvement into a governance system beyond sort of just a problem solving mechanism, because of the uncertainty that's ahead with AI and all of these other things that are on the horizon, and because of the just sort of increased responsibility of public school systems if they're going to stay around, if we're going to continue to have a public school system to really deliver for kids. We have to embrace this idea that you cannot have uniform universal education and deliver for all kids. You have to have context appropriate services for children and families and communities, and having that context appropriate service actually requires moving away from bureaucracy, because bureaucracy, the in sort of inherent in its logic is this idea of uniformity and equality, sort of like, you know, all likes get alike. All likes get the same thing. All likes get, and we have so many unlikes, and those unlikes have to be treated differently. And you have to figure out how to treat those folks differently in ways that are appropriate to their particular context. And you need a different logic. You actually need an improvement logic to do that type of discovery. And that is even more so the case now that we have all of these technologies coming into play that folks are going to need to figure out how to use best to deliver those services. Well, honestly, the biggest challenge is it's really hard, especially if you're working in a very big system. And the reality is, if you're working in a large institution, like if you were talking about moving an entire large school district to this as their sort of predominant governing logic. Um, it's a tremendous amount of work, and that is very difficult, and, I would say part of that work is that it requires a lot of structure, and it requires a lot of skill and capacity building and shifting of mental models to move away from something that is really sort of the predominant mental model of how our institutions should work, to something that is much more flexible, nimble, standards-oriented, adaptive, changing and evolving based on what is learned at any given moment so that tomorrow might look a little bit different from today. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about transition pathways and we think a lot about sort of like what is the ideal steady state. In reality, with a lot of these huge systems, you have a leading governance model for various sets of activities, and you might still need to use other governance models. There might be some braiding that occurs to make sure you can deliver your full set of responsibilities at the highest possible service level. And so, in these transition pathways, it can get quite meta because basically, if you're moving from a model of bureaucracy to, a model where you're using a lot of evolutionary learning to govern activity, it actually might be the case that you need to use other governance models as sort of like shocks to the system or to dislodge some of the other practices to get to end up in the steady state that you want to end up in. And so, with the systems that we work with, we often use evolutionary learning as the way to figure out what governance moves to move along this transition pathway. And you can imagine it gets incredibly complex. Even if as I'm explaining this answer, it feels sort of like so meta. And so I do think the complexity of the work is honestly one of the biggest challenges, and something we think a lot about is how can you make something first that is often invisible to folks visible. It can be very hard for people to even see the governance model that they're working in, including if they're leading the system. Sometimes it's hard to see the logic that you're using to organize your activity, particularly if it's a logic that's inherited and sort of accepted as the way to go about things. It's the water that you're in, and so how do you get folks to see that? And then how do you get folks to see a different way of governing as essential? And then how do you get folks to actually move along that path in a disciplined way, including because it can take in large systems quite a bit of time. So honestly, in a lot of the work that we do, sometimes we just start doing it. We don't talk about what we're doing until we're sort of well underway. And then we start peeling back the layers and making visible some of the deeper systems changes that are occurring, which is one of the ways that we've tried to tackle this challenge of the complexity. Another way is just working shoulder to shoulder with folks. Another way is trying to make more explicit and codifying and writing about and having conversations like these to get folks talking about these ideas. But it is a real challenge because it is not something to take on if you're faint of heart. I will say that. Well, one of the things that we say is, you have to sort of right size your change ambitions. And so we encourage folks, if they're interested in shifting governance, to think about, first sort of like what is your readiness for change, your organizational readiness for change, not just your personally, but how ready is the organization that you're working in or leading ready for change? And then what is your sphere of influence? And if folks are in organizations where they have sort of a narrow sphere of influence and their organization is not ready for change, um, we've sort of learned that basically you can govern whether you're an individual, your own activity using evolutionary learning, which probably puts you more in like an improvement project sort of orientation, or you might be able to manage a team using evolutionary learning. But it's probably unrealistic to think that you're going to like transform your whole organization. um, so, and then you have all the way up to, folks who have really high degrees of influence over the work or the organization, and really high levels of organizational readiness. And then we say, like, go for it, you're all in. And if you're in shades in between, we start to think about how can you seed organizational readiness so that you can make sort of do the ground softening that it would require to get to folks who are high degrees of influence being ready for this change, and high degrees of the organization overall being ready for the change. So yes, I do think you have to be very, very realistic about what's possible, because it can be extremely counterproductive and costly to try and take on a change ambition that is just sort of out of the sphere of reality.